I had always felt a certain tension when I was around Richard, my boss. He was one of those men who demanded respect without asking for it, whose silence could fill a room more than any words could. Tonight, however, something about him felt different, something sharp in the air that made me uneasy even before the evening had truly begun. When he invited me out, I hadn't been sure whether it was a professional gesture or a personal one. Richard wasn't one to mix business with pleasure. His private life, if he had one, was a mystery to me. All I knew was the professional Richard, the cold, calculating figure who commanded the room with little more than a glance. That was the Richard the First had always known. Yet tonight, something in the way he had phrased the invitation made me think this could be different. I arrived at the upscale restaurant just before him, the valet taking my car with a nod that barely acknowledged my presence. The evening was unusually warm for the time of year, and the air felt thick with the buzz of the city. I stepped inside the restaurant, greeted by a host who led me to a private corner, one that seemed to have been reserved specifically for Richard's group. It was tucked away from the rest of the patrons, hidden behind plush curtains and soft, dim lighting that made everything feel just a bit more intimate. I sat at the table, adjusting my suit jacket and feeling the weight of the situation settle on me. Was this a casual dinner, or was there an agenda? Richard wasn't one to share personal details, and the thought that I might be here for more than a simple meal crossed my mind. Was this some sort of test? Or worse, was I being sized up for something I wasn't aware of? When Richard arrived, he was alone. His presence immediately filled the space, his tall frame moving with a purpose that matched his usual air of control. I stood up to greet him, feeling that nervous tension creep back in. "Richard," I said, offering my hand, trying to sound confident despite the unease building in my chest. He offered a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's sit." We ordered drinks and settled into a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but certainly not warm either. Richard didn't seem eager to speak, and I, in turn, didn't push. I had learned over the years that with him, silence could be an ally. If you let it, it would reveal what he was thinking without him ever having to say a word. The night wore on, and I tried to engage him in conversation about work, but every attempt was met with brief, disinterested answers. I could feel myself growing more self-conscious with each word I spoke. Was I being too forward? Was I saying the wrong thing? I tried to shift the topic, thinking a bit of humor might break the ice. "Did you hear about the new project our team is handling?" I asked, hoping to draw out some enthusiasm from him. He looked at me then, his eyes sharp. "I'm aware," he replied, his voice flat. "But I'm not here to talk about work." I was taken aback, unsure of how to respond. Richard had always been the type to bring work into everything. If anything, it was a safe space to talk with him. But tonight, he seemed uninterested in the things that usually mattered to both of us. It was as if I was speaking a language he no longer understood. I tried again, this time shifting to something more neutral, a light-hearted topic about a recent corporate event we had attended. But once more, his response was short, detached. The disconnection between us was palpable. "You're quiet tonight," I said, half expecting him to brush it off. His gaze hardened for a moment, and then, almost imperceptibly, he stood up. I watched as he pushed his chair back and walked away, leaving me staring after him, stunned and confused. I didn't know what to do. I sat there for a few moments, wondering if I should follow him, or if he had just left to take a phone call. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that he wasn't coming back. What had just happened? I couldn't wrap my mind around it. He had invited me out, sure, but this was different. It was almost as if he had done it on purpose, like he was making a statement I couldn't understand. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor in the quiet restaurant. I grabbed my coat, paid for the meal, and walked out into the cool night air. The city buzzed around me, but my mind was elsewhere, still trying to make sense of what had just transpired. Had I said something wrong? Had I misread the situation entirely? Or had Richard just taken it personally, whatever it was? The question lingered in my mind long after I returned to my apartment, its weight sitting heavily on my chest. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure if I would ever get them. The next few days passed in a haze of confusion. At work, Richard's coldness hung in the air like a heavy fog. Every time I passed by his office, I caught a glimpse of him through the glass walls, his back turned, eyes focused on something I couldn't see. He didn't look up when I walked by. I wondered if he had even noticed me at all. Maybe he didn't care to. I spent my days in the office trying to focus on tasks that, in the grand scheme of things, felt unimportant. It was hard to concentrate when I couldn't shake the image of Richard walking away from me. It played on repeat in my mind, each time with a different interpretation. Had I done something wrong? Was this all just an awkward misunderstanding? Or had he purposefully distanced himself from me, perhaps even resented me in some way that I hadn't yet realized? I tried reaching out, of course. A polite email asking if we could meet to discuss the upcoming project. Nothing. A follow-up message a few days later, with a more direct tone. Still nothing. It was as though I had become invisible to him, and the realization stung more than I wanted to admit. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, staring at the screen of my phone. A message from my sister popped up, breaking the silence. She didn't know about the dinner with Richard, but I decided to mention it to her. Maybe she could offer some perspective. She had always been good at reading people, something I lacked. I typed quickly, telling her about what had happened, about the awkward evening, Richard's cold departure, and how I couldn't get him out of my head. The message ended with a simple question: what am I missing here? Her response came faster than I expected. You really have no idea, do you? I blinked at the words, confused. What was that supposed to mean? I typed back quickly, asking her what she meant, but she didn't reply for several minutes. When she finally did, her message was cryptic at best. There's more to Richard than you think. His problem isn't with you. It's with your family. I stared at the screen, the words echoing in my mind. What did she mean by that? My family? I hadn't even known that Richard had any sort of connection to my family. He had always been so focused on business, on work, that anything personal about him remained a mystery. I had to know more, so I called her, needing to hear the tone of her voice. She picked up almost immediately. Don't tell me you've been living under a rock, she said, her voice tinged with amusement, though I could tell there was something more serious beneath it. You don't think Richard has a history with your family? That's kind of naive, don't you think? History? I echoed, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. What kind of history? There was a long pause before she spoke again. You've never asked about him, have you? About what's behind that cold exterior of his? No, I admitted, my mind racing. I've never thought to. I always figured he was just, well, like that. He's not just like that, she replied firmly. He's carrying something from your family's past. Something that's been brewing for years. I could barely process her words. My family had always kept to themselves, especially when it came to business matters. I had no idea what she was referring to, and the thought of Richard being involved in something deeper made my head spin. Listen, she continued, her voice softer now. I can't get into all the details right now, but trust me, there's more to this than you think. Richard didn't walk away from you that night because of something you did. He's holding on to something, and you're caught in the middle of it. If you want answers, you're going to have to dig deeper into your family's past. Ask questions. See what you find. I hung up the phone, my head buzzing with uncertainty. What was I supposed to do with this information? My family had always been private, even secretive in some ways. I couldn't imagine what sort of connection Richard could have to them, and yet, my sister's words lingered. Something was there, something that had remained hidden for far too long. The next few days were a blur as I tried to piece everything together. I tried to act normal at work, to push the thought of Richard's abrupt departure to the back of my mind, but it was impossible. Every time I saw him, I felt that same tension, that same coldness radiating from him. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something against me, something I didn't understand. I started asking around, cautiously, trying to learn more about Richard and his connection to my family. But the answers I received were vague, at best. My colleagues seemed reluctant to discuss him, and whenever I brought up the topic, the conversation would quickly shift. It was as though no one wanted to get involved. It only made me more determined to find out what was going on. One evening, I decided to take a risk. I went to visit my parents. They had always been tight-lipped about certain things, especially when it came to business, but I felt like I had no other choice. I needed to understand what Richard's connection to them was. Maybe they knew something I didn't. My mother answered the door, looking surprised to see me. "What's going on? You don't usually visit unannounced." "I need to ask you something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "About Richard. Do you know anything about him?" Her expression hardened at the mention of his name. "Why would you want to know about him?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I think something's going on. Something personal. He walked away from me the other night, and I don't understand why." My mother's eyes flickered for a moment, then she sighed, stepping aside to let me in. "Come inside. I think it's time you knew." As I walked into the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she was about to tell me, it would change everything. My mother closed the door behind me with a soft click, and for a moment, the silence between us was deafening. I sat on the couch, my mind racing, trying to prepare myself for whatever she was about to say. I could see it in her face, there was something she had been holding back, something buried deep for far too long. She sat across from me, her expression unreadable. "You need to understand something about Richard," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not what you think. There's a history between him and our family that goes back years, and I don't know how much you know about your father's business dealings, but Richard has always been a part of the shadowed side of it." I blinked, unsure if I had heard her right. "Richard? What do you mean?" "I've only known him as my boss." My mother's eyes darkened. "Richard wasn't always in your father's circle. He came from nothing, from a family who didn't have the luxury of playing by the same rules. Your father met him early on in his career. Richard was ambitious, too ambitious for his own good. But he had something your father needed at the time." I sat back, trying to digest the information. "What did he need?" "My father," she continued, "was involved in some questionable deals early in his career. Richard had the connections, he knew people who could help your father expand his business. They partnered up, but it was never a partnership of equals. Richard was always on the outside, looking in. Your father used him when he needed something, then discarded him when it was no longer convenient. It wasn't just business, though. There were personal things at play, too. Richard had a falling out with your father over something private, something your father never spoke about." I swallowed, the weight of her words sinking in. What happened? What did Richard want from my father? My mother hesitated, then took a deep breath. Richard wanted more than just business. He wanted power. Respect. And when he realized he wasn't going to get it from your father, he tried to get it through other means. He had a personal connection with someone in your family, someone close to your father, someone who could have ruined everything. That's when your father cut him off completely. And Richard never forgave him. I sat in stunned silence, trying to piece together the puzzle. So, he's holding on to this anger? This grudge against us because of something that happened before I was even born? My mother nodded slowly. Exactly. And it's not just some passing grudge. It's deep. Richard feels like he was wronged in the worst possible way, and no matter how much time has passed, he's never let it go. When you started working for him, he saw a chance, a way to get closer to your family again, to get some sort of closure, I think. But he also sees you as a reminder of everything that went wrong. My chest tightened, and I felt as if I was suffocating under the weight of the revelation. Richard's coldness, his detachment, his sudden dismissal of me, it all made sense now. But that didn't make it any easier to understand or accept. Do you think he knows I'm involved in all of this? I asked, my voice shaking. He knows, my mother replied quietly. He's been watching you, waiting for the right moment. And now, you've become part of the very thing he's been carrying around for years. Whether he realizes it or not, you're entangled in his vendetta. I felt a strange mix of anger and sorrow rise within me. Anger at Richard for holding me accountable for things I had no control over, and sorrow for the fact that my family's past was being dragged into my present. This wasn't my fight. But somehow, I was now standing in the middle of it. I don't know what to do with all of this, I confessed, running a hand through my hair. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it. My mother sighed and leaned back in her chair. Neither did Richard. But sometimes, when people are wronged, they can't see past the hurt. They become consumed by it, and it takes over everything. I felt like I was suffocating in a fog of guilt and confusion. What had I done to deserve any of this? All I had ever done was try to do my job, to prove myself. And yet, here I was, caught in the crossfire of a family war I didn't even know existed. I need to talk to him, I said suddenly, standing up from the couch. I need to understand why he walked away from me, why he's been so distant. My mother's eyes softened, but she didn't stop me. You can try, but just remember, Richard isn't going to forgive easily. He's been holding on to this grudge for far too long. You'll have to decide if you're willing to face it head-on, knowing what you're up against. I nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle over me. If I was going to make this right, if I was going to understand what Richard truly wanted, I needed to confront him. There was no running away from it anymore. The next day, I arranged to meet Richard in his office. I had no idea what to expect, no idea how he would react. But I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. I had to know the truth. When I walked into his office, he didn't look up immediately. He was typing something on his computer, his posture rigid, as if trying to shut out the world. I stood there for a moment, watching him, feeling a strange mix of nerves and determination. Finally, he looked up, his gaze cold and calculating. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low. I took a deep breath. "I need to understand why you walked away that night. Why you've been avoiding me." For a long moment, there was silence. Richard studied me, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether or not to respond. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not about you," he said, his tone sharp. It's about everything you represent. And I'm not sure I can forgive your family for what they did. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was it, the moment of truth. I didn't have a part in any of that, I said, my voice trembling but determined. I'm not responsible for what happened. I didn't even know about it. Richard's gaze softened just for a moment, but then the hardness returned. Maybe not. But it doesn't change anything. I've carried this for too long. And I'm not sure I can let it go. I took a step closer to him, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't want to be part of this war. But I want to understand. I need to understand. Richard's expression flickered for a moment, and I saw a glimmer of the man he once was, the man who had once been my mentor, the man who had believed in me, even if just for a brief time. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the pain behind his eyes. Maybe you can't fix this, he said quietly. But maybe you can help me try. And in that moment, I realized that the past wasn't something I could erase. But it was something I could face, something we could face together. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to find a way forward.